The morning they told me to leave, it was raining. Not the soft kind of rain that makes you feel like the world is washing itself clean. This was the kind that came sideways, cold, indifferent, the kind that soaks through your collar before you even realize it started. I was 19 years old, standing in the doorway of Mercer House with a black trash bag containing everything I had ever owned. A donated winter jacket 2 sizes too large. 3 pairs of socks. A Bible with half the pages torn out. A photograph of a woman I barely remembered, my mother, taken sometime before the accident, before the state, before all of it. A mess. Calloway, the facility director, didn't even come out to say goodbye. It was Gerald, the night custodian, who handed me the bag. He smelled like floor cleaner and cigarettes. He said, "Good luck, son." He didn't look me in the eye when he said it. I stood on that porch for maybe 3 minutes after the door closed. Just listening to the rain hit the roof. Listening to the specific silence of a place that used to be home, deciding, quietly and without ceremony, that you were no longer its problem. I was 19. I had $43 in a crumpled envelope. I had nowhere to go. And for the first time in my life, for the very first time, there was no system left to catch me. The town of Harwick, Kentucky, is the kind of place that never quite became anything. There was a time, people said, when the coal kept it alive. When men had work and women had purpose and the diner on Route 9 stayed open past 9. But the mines went quiet in the 90s, and after that, Harwick just sort of exhaled. Like it had been holding its breath for decades and finally gave up waiting for something better. I'd lived my whole life in that town without ever really living in it. Mercer House sat on its eastern edge, behind a rusted chain-link fence, and for 17 years it had been my entire world. I knew its hallways. I knew which floorboards creaked. I knew that the third stall in the boys' bathroom flooded every winter and that Mr. Denny, who used to run activities night, was the only adult who ever asked me what I was thinking about, not what I had done wrong. Mr. Denny left in 2019 when the funding got cut. I never saw him again. After he left, I stopped talking much. The other kids cycled through. Some got adopted, the younger ones, mostly, the ones with round faces and easy smiles. I watched them go. I learned not to get attached. I had a habit, by the time I was 16, of sitting by the window after lights out and just watching the highway in the distance. Watching the headlights move. Wondering where people were going at 2 in the morning and whether any of them had any idea how lucky they were, just to be going somewhere. Just to have a destination. When I aged out at 19, they gave me the trash bag and the $43 and a printed sheet of local resources, a shelter address, a food bank, the county unemployment office. The sheet was laminated, which felt almost cruel. Like it had been used so many times they stopped bothering to print fresh ones. The shelter on Clement Street had 18 beds and a wait list. They said I could check back Thursday. It was Monday. I spent the first 2 nights on a bench near the public library, under the overhang. I didn't sleep much. I kept the photograph of my mother in my jacket pocket, close to my chest, not because it comforted me but because it was the only thing I had that proved I had come from somewhere. On the 3rd day, I went to the unemployment office. The woman behind the desk had a nameplate that said Brenda, and the energy of someone who had answered the same questions 10,000 times. Work history. I helped maintain the facility. Cleaning, yard work, minor repairs. Formal employment? No. Education? Ged. She typed something. Her expression didn't change. I got a call back from one place, a chicken processing plant 15 miles outside town. The pay was $8.20 an hour. The bus didn't run out there. When I explained I didn't have a car, the woman on the phone said she was sorry and hung up. I ate at the food bank on Tuesdays and Thursdays. I learned which gas stations didn't chase you off if you sat near the entrance. I learned that dignity, when you don't have money, is a luxury you have to consciously decide to hold on to, because the world will find every quiet way to take it from you. By the end of the third week, I had $11 left. And I had begun, slowly, in the way that happens without you noticing, to believe that the life I was living was simply the life I deserved. It was a Tuesday when I saw the sign. I was walking the long way back from the food bank, cutting through the older part of town near the county records building, when I saw it nailed to a telephone pole. It wasn't a professional sign. It was a piece of cardboard, written in marker, slightly warped from old rain. Land for sale. 4.2 acres. Route 11, past the old fairgrounds. $1. County auction. Wednesday 9 a.m. Cash only. I stopped. I read it again. $1. My first thought was that it was a mistake. My second thought was that it was some kind of scam. My third thought, and this one came quieter, almost like a whisper, was what if it isn't? I went to the county records office that afternoon. A tired man named Dale pulled the file for me without much interest. The land was real. 4.2 acres on the edge of Route 11, past where the old Harwick Fairgrounds used to be. It had been county seized for back taxes, the original owner had died decades ago, no heirs had ever come forward. After years of sitting on the books, the county was auctioning it off just to clear the record. Why so cheap? I asked. Dale shrugged. Nobody wants it. Land's classified as non-arable. There's some kind of spring or water feature on it that made the soil too saturated for farming back in the day. County just wants it off the liability ledger. A spring? That's what the old file says. Never been properly surveyed. I took the address. I walked the 3 miles out to Route 11 that evening, even though my shoes had a hole in the left sole that let the cold in. The land sat behind a rusted cattle gate, half buried in tall grass. I climbed over and walked through the field as the sun dropped low. The grass was thick and pale, the kind that grows when nothing has been disturbed for a long time. There were old oaks along one edge, enormous and ancient, their roots surfacing from the ground like the knuckles of buried hands. I found the spring near the back corner of the property. It was strange. I don't have a better word for it. The water came up from the ground in a small pool, maybe 8 feet across, and it was blue, not the ordinary blue of reflected sky, but a deeper blue, almost luminescent. The kind of blue that you don't immediately trust. The grass around it grew in thick, vivid green rings, denser and darker than anything else on the property. The air near it felt different, too, cooler and heavier, with a faint mineral smell, like stone after rain. I crouched beside it for a long time. I remember thinking that it looked like something out of a dream. Or a warning. I went back the next morning with my $11. The auction was in a small room at the county building. There were 3 other bidders. None of them bid on my parcel. The county clerk accepted my dollar bill with the bored efficiency of someone processing a parking ticket. I walked out holding a deed to 4.2 acres of land that no one else wanted. I sat on the courthouse steps for a while after, holding that piece of paper. I didn't feel triumphant. I felt something closer to terrified. Because now I had something. And when you have something, even something small, even something uncertain, you can lose it. And for a boy who had spent 19 years learning to want nothing, the possibility of loss felt enormous. But I had $1 left in my pocket and a deed in my hand and nowhere else to go. So I went to the land. I slept in the field the first 3 nights. I made a rough shelter using branches from the fallen oak at the property's southern edge and a tarp I found half buried near the old cattle gate. It kept the wind off but not the damp. I woke each morning with my back aching and my hands stiff, and the first thing I always saw was the blue of the spring through the grass, glowing faintly in the early light. I told myself I just needed a plan. But planning requires knowing what's possible, and I didn't know enough about anything to plan properly. The county extension office was on the main road, 2 miles back. I started going there every few days, asking questions that I was embarrassed to ask and asking them anyway. A woman named Patricia, 50s, practical hands, the kind of person who gives direct answers, was the one who finally sat down with me and took me seriously. "What kind of soil you got?" "Saturated, mostly. There's a spring at the back." "What kind of spring?" "Blue. Mineral, I think." "Cold." She looked at me for a moment. "You're on the old Harker parcel, aren't you?" "I bought it, yeah. I know that land. Old-timers used to say the spring ran from limestone caves underneath. Nobody could farm it because the drainage was all wrong, water table too high in places, too dry in others. But..." She paused, pulled a binder from her shelf. "That kind of spring can be a resource, if you know what you're doing." If. I spent the next several weeks learning what I didn't know, which turned out to be nearly everything. I read every pamphlet Patricia gave me. I walked the land systematically, section by section, noting where the water pooled and where it drained. I learned, slowly, that the ground wasn't uniformly saturated, there was a pattern to it, shaped by the underground geology. The areas closest to the spring were dense and dark. Further from it, the soil became more workable. I had no tools. No money for tools. I started doing odd jobs in town, hauling, cleaning, anything people would pay for in cash. A hardware store owner named Roy let me work weekends sweeping and organizing in exchange for store credit. I spent the credit on basic tools, a hand spade, seeds, a folding knife. I planted my first rows in late spring. Kale and spinach near the spring's edge where the soil stayed moist. Tomatoes and beans further out, in the better drained sections. Everything died. I'm not being dramatic. Everything died. The kale turned yellow within 2 weeks. The tomatoes never broke soil at all. The beans came up pale and collapsed inward like they were ashamed. I stood in that failed field in the June heat and I thought about quitting. I thought about it with a specific, focused intensity. I thought about what quitting would even mean: go back to the bench by the library. Go back to the food bank line, the shelter wait list, the world that had already decided what I was worth. I didn't quit. But I can't pretend I was brave about it. I wasn't brave. I was just more afraid of going backward than forward. Patricia tested the soil for me. She had a basic kit at the extension office. The results came back complicated. The mineral content near the spring was unusual, high in certain trace elements, iron and calcium particularly, and the pH ran slightly alkaline. It wasn't bad soil. It was specific soil. Soil that needed specific plants. "You're not thinking about this right," she told me. "You're trying to grow what you know. You need to grow what this land knows." That sentence stayed with me for a long time. I started researching plants adapted to high mineral, high moisture, alkaline environments. Some of them were unusual: watercress, which could grow directly in the spring's outflow. Elderberry, which thrives in wet, mineral-rich soil. Certain lavenders that do well in alkaline conditions. Arrowhead plants. Comfrey, which, Patricia explained, is one of the most powerful soil-building plants that exists. Its deep roots break up compaction and its leaves, when composted, return minerals to the surface. I replanted. Differently this time. By late July, the watercress was growing so thick along the spring's edge that I had to thin it back. The elder seedlings I'd gotten from a nursery in exchange for 2 days of labor showed their first leaves. The comfrey grew broad and resilient, spreading in a way that felt almost aggressive, alive in a way my earlier plantings never had been. I still had no permanent shelter. I built a better structure using salvaged lumber from an old barn on Roy's property that he let me dismantle. It wasn't a house. It was barely more than walls and a roof. But it was solid. I built it myself, learning by doing, which means I made every possible mistake at least once. There were nights I sat against the elder tree I'd planted at the spring's edge and looked at the blue water and talked to it. I know how that sounds. I wasn't delusional. I just needed something to talk to. I told it about the orphanage. About Mr. Denny. About my mother's photograph. About the specific weight of being 19 and untethered and responsible for yourself in a way you were never taught. The spring never answered. But the water stayed blue, and the rings of green around it kept growing outward, slowly, in the way that real growth always happens, without announcement. It happened in October, almost by accident. I had started bringing the watercress into town to sell at the small farmers' market that ran on Saturday mornings near the church. I had no table, no sign, nothing professional. I spread it on a blanket and priced it at $2 a bunch. The first Saturday, I sold 4 bunches. But the second Saturday, a woman stopped at my blanket and crouched down and picked up the watercress and smelled it and looked at me very carefully. Her name was Elaine Marsh. She was 60, sharp-eyed, and she ran a small farm-to-table restaurant called The Hollow in the next town over, which I later learned had been written up in a regional food magazine. "Where is this from?" she asked. "My land. Out past the fairgrounds." "The spring land? The Harker parcel? You know it?" "My father used to tell stories about that spring. Said the water had a specific mineral taste, that anything grown near it had an unusual quality." She paused. "Is that true? Does it taste different?" I hadn't thought much about it, honestly. I'd been eating the watercress for months out of necessity. But now I tried to think about it clearly. "It's more intense," I said. "Like the flavors more concentrated." She bought every bunch I had. $22. Then she handed me her card and said, "If you can get me a consistent supply, I'll pay you a real wholesale rate. But I need to see the source first." She came to the land the following week. I watched her walk to the spring and crouch beside it the same way I had that first evening. She looked at the water for a long time. Then she put her fingers in it and tasted it, carefully, thoughtfully, like a person reading a language in a very old book. "It's the limestone," she said finally. "The aquifer runs through ancient marine limestone. It's mineralizing the water. Whatever you grow in this soil or with this water is going to have a flavor profile that's essentially impossible to replicate elsewhere." She stood up. She looked at me with a directness I wasn't used to. "You have something genuinely rare here. Do you understand that?" I didn't answer right away. Because the truth was, I had been so focused on survival, on just making one plant grow, just getting one thing right, that I had never let myself see the land as something valuable. I had seen it as a problem to solve. As a last resort. As the thing I got when there was nothing else. I had never, not once, let myself see it as a gift. That afternoon, after she left, I sat by the spring for 2 hours. Just sat there. The water was the same deep blue it always was. The comfrey had spread in a wide circle around it. The elder trees were starting to lose their leaves, dropping them into the water's edge, where they dissolved slowly. I thought about the caseworker who had written in my file, at age 12, that I showed limited potential for independent success. I had seen the file by accident at 15. I had carried that phrase like a stone in my chest ever since. I thought about Gerald handing me the trash bag. About the laminated sheet of resources. About $11 and a $1 deed and a field full of dead kale. The breakthrough didn't feel like victory. It felt quieter than that. It felt like something releasing, like a rope that had been pulled tight for years finally going slack. The first contract with Elaine was small, watercress and elderflowers, seasonal, at a price that was real but not extraordinary. But it was consistent. And consistency, I was learning, is what changes everything. I reinvested almost every dollar. A proper irrigation system, modest, second-hand, but functional, that let me direct the spring's outflow systematically across different sections of the land. Raised beds with better soil management. More perennial plants that, once established, would produce for years without replanting: comfrey, elder, lavender, horseradish. Which turned out to love the mineral-dense conditions near the spring's edge. I built a proper small house. Not large. Not impressive. But mine, built with my own hands, board by board, over a span of 8 months, making mistakes and correcting them. Learning the language of construction the same way I'd learned the language of soil. There were nights I lay on the floor of the unfinished structure and looked up at the sky through the open roof frame and felt something I couldn't name at the time. I can name it now. It was ownership. Not of the land, I mean something deeper. Ownership of the direction of my own life. The specific, hard-won knowledge that what happened next was, for the first time, up to me. But growth is never clean. It has consequences that you don't anticipate. Patricia, who had guided me through so much, got sick in the winter of that second year, a serious illness that kept her away from the extension office for months. Without her, I felt the isolation more sharply. I made mistakes I wouldn't have made with her guidance. I overextended one section of the land and damaged the drainage. I lost a full season of lavender because I hadn't properly winterized the beds. Those losses were expensive. Not just financially. I had started to believe, maybe too easily, that I had figured it out. That the hard part was over. The lavender dying in the ground was a reminder that this kind of life doesn't reward complacency. It rewards attention. I also had to learn something that the orphanage had never taught me: how to ask for help without feeling like it made you less. I called an agricultural extension specialist from the state university. I was nervous making the call, embarrassed by how much I didn't know. The specialist, a young man named Torres, came out to the land and spent an entire Saturday with me going through drainage mapping and soil testing. He didn't make me feel stupid. He was genuinely interested in the spring. "This is a hydrogeological anomaly," he said, standing at the water's edge with a notebook. "This kind of mineral-rich cold spring in limestone karst terrain, it's unusual for this region. The ecological value alone is significant." Ecological value? Rare plant species, potentially. Invertebrate communities adapted to the specific mineral conditions. It might be worth having a biologist come look at it. I hadn't thought about the spring as an ecosystem. I had thought about it as a resource, a feature, a strange and beautiful accident of geology. I hadn't considered that it might be alive in ways I couldn't see. I started learning differently after that. Not just about what the land could give me, but about what I owed the land. About the difference between using something and being in relationship with it. I reduced my extraction from the spring's direct outflow. I started protecting the margins, leaving buffer zones of native plants around the water's edge. I began documenting what grew there naturally, working with Torres and eventually a graduate student in ecology named Maris, who came out every month and took samples and got quietly more excited with each visit. My income grew, slowly, then steadily. Elaine became a committed buyer. 2 other restaurants started ordering from me. A local herbalist began purchasing dried elder and lavender. I wasn't wealthy. But I was no longer afraid of winter. And I had begun, without fully planning it, to build something that had a function beyond feeding me. Something that other people were invested in. Something that was becoming, in a small and unglamorous way, part of the community I had always lived beside but never quite belonged to. In the spring of the 3rd year, Maris came to the land with a colleague, a botanist named Dr. Reyes, who had driven up from the university specifically to see the spring. She walked the margins for 2 hours. She photographed everything. She took water samples and sediment samples and pressed several plants that were growing in the transition zone between the spring's edge and the open field. Then she called me over and showed me something on her camera, a small plant, low and spreading, with pale green leaves and tiny root nodules. Do you know what this is? No. It's Cardamine concatenata. Cutleaf toothwort. It's not rare on its own, but what's growing with it? She zoomed in. There was another plant, smaller, almost invisible unless you were looking for it, with distinctive fan-shaped leaves. This is Batricium lunaria. Moonwort. It's a species that's been considered locally extinct in this region for about 60 years. I looked at the photograph. Then I looked at the ground where I was standing. It was here the whole time, I said. This type of karst spring system can maintain microhabitats that are essentially time capsules, she said. The consistent mineral composition, the temperature stability, the hydrology, it can sustain conditions that no longer exist in the surrounding landscape. Species that disappeared from the region may have persisted in pockets like this for decades. Unseen. Unseen. I walked back to the spring alone that afternoon. I stood at its edge and looked at the blue water, at the complicated, layered, living world at its margins, the world that had been there long before I found this place. Long before anyone thought to put a dollar value on it. I thought about something Patricia had said in the beginning. You're trying to grow what you know. You need to grow what this land knows. I hadn't understood it then. I understood it now. The land had been growing things in my absence, in everyone's absence, without approval, without funding, without recognition. It had been quietly, persistently alive. Sustaining species that the wider world had given up on. Not because anyone was paying attention, but because that's what life does when it's left alone in the right conditions. I thought about the caseworker's note. Limited potential for independent success. I thought about the trash bag. The laminated resource sheet. The rain on the day I left. And I realized something that hit me with the quiet force of a tide rather than a wave. I had believed, for most of my life, that I was the boy who had been given up on. The discarded thing. The liability on someone else's ledger, just like this land had been a liability on the county's ledger. $1. Worth nothing. Get it off the books. And what the land had taught me, not through metaphor but through actual, literal, physical reality, was that the things the world discards are not always without value. Sometimes they are without recognition. Sometimes what looks like dead ground is actually a time capsule. Sometimes what looks like a boy with limited potential is actually someone who needed specific conditions, not any conditions, not easy conditions, but specific ones, to grow. The moonwort had been there for 60 years. Unseen. Persistent. Real. I had been there for 19 years. Unseen. Persistent. Real. The spring had known what it was the whole time. It had just needed someone to stop walking past it. The land is different now. Not dramatically. You won't drive past it on Route 11 and think you're looking at something exceptional. It's still a field, still 4.2 acres, still bounded by old oaks and tall grass at the margins. The small house I built sits at the northern edge, plain and functional, with a vegetable garden along one side and the elder trees growing full and heavy with summer flowers. But if you walk to the back corner, past the comfrey and the lavender beds and the stone path I laid over 2 weekends last autumn, if you walk all the way back, you'll find the spring. Still blue. Still cold. Still carrying something up from deep in the earth, something ancient and mineral and unhurried. And growing around it, in the carefully protected margins, you'll find plants that most people in this region have never seen. Plants that were here before me and will be here long after. Plants that survived not because someone saved them, but because they found the one place where the conditions were right. Elaine put the watercress on her spring menu this year with a note about where it comes from. 2 university researchers now have ongoing field studies on the property. The county, which sold me this land for $1 because they considered it a liability, has now twice approached me about conservation easement discussions. I told them I'd think about it. I'm not in a hurry anymore. Hurrying is what you do when you're afraid. When you believe that if you stop moving, the world will catch you and put you back in the box it built for you. I know now that the box was never real. Patricia recovered. She came to see the spring for the first time last spring, and she stood at its edge for a long time without saying anything. Then she looked at me and said, "It's exactly what I always suspected it was." I asked her what she meant. Something that just needed the right person to pay attention. I keep my mother's photograph on the windowsill now, in the house I built myself, on land that no one else wanted. I don't know everything about her. I don't know why she was driving that night, or whether she thought about me in the years before the accident, or what she would say if she could see where I am now. I've made peace with not knowing. What I know is this: she was real. I came from somewhere real. And something in me, something that kept going through the shelter waitlist and the dead kale and the failed first season and the laminated resource sheet, something in me was worth keeping. The spring knew it. The moonwort knew it. This land, this strange, discarded, $1 land, knew it before I did. Here is what I want to leave you with: the world will always have a category for you. A file. A line on a ledger. A printed assessment of what you are worth and what you are likely to become. And sometimes, maybe more often than we admit, that assessment is made by people who never once sat in the specific conditions of your life long enough to see what was actually growing there. They look at the saturated ground and the strange water and they say, not arable. Liability. $1. They don't stay long enough to find the moonwort. The question I want to ask you, and I mean this sincerely, not rhetorically, is this: what has the world assessed you to be worth? And have you stayed long enough in your own life to see what's actually growing there? Because sometimes the most extraordinary things survive in the places that no one was watching. Sometimes all they needed was for someone to stop walking past.